The morning briefing started at 0600 sharp, but Captain Valerie Kincaid had been awake since 4. She stood at the edge of Forward Operating Base Falcon, watching the sun bleed orange across the rugged desert mountains, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The base hummed with its usual pre-dawn rhythm, generators churning, radios crackling, boots on gravel as the night shift handed over to day crews. Valerie had been stationed here for 8 months, and every morning felt the same. She was invisible. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. Her fellow pilots, some with a hint of misguided affection, called her Sparrow behind her back, though never with malice. She was the kind of pilot who could coax a broken bird back into the sky, who knew every system diagram, who could strip and rebuild a jet engine blindfolded. But when it came to the real missions, the ones that mattered, she was always left behind, grounded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The briefing tent buzzed with anticipation as Valerie slipped inside. Maps covered every surface, red pins marking hostile territories, blue lines tracing flight paths. Major Harding stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled air crews. Valerie found a spot near the back, her tablet ready, though she already knew what was coming. Her role in these critical operations was purely administrative, a formality she resented with every fiber of her being. Today's interdiction mission is codenamed Desert Shadow, Harding announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. We've got intelligence on a significant enemy logistics convoy moving through Sector 7. Heavy anti-air presence, difficult terrain for low-altitude flight. I need my best pilots on this one. Valerie's stylus hovered over her notepad. As Harding began reading names, a familiar ache started in her chest. Captain Miller, your lead pilot, Viper 1. Lieutenant Davies, you're his wingman, Viper 2. Captain Chen, you'll provide top cover, Cobra 3. The names continued, each one a small knife twisting in Valerie's gut. She had trained alongside these men for months, had outscored most of them in flight simulations, could navigate target acquisition maps better than anyone in the unit. She possessed an uncanny knack for identifying weaknesses in enemy air defenses, an intuition that had saved countless virtual lives in training exercises. Yet, when the real missions came, the ones that truly mattered, she was always assigned to flight operations support. Captain Kincaid, Harding's voice cut through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. You're on flight manifest and tactical communications. Make sure all flight plans are updated and comms are clear when the birds return. Tactical communications again. Valerie nodded curtly, her jaw tight. Around her, the selected flight crews exchanged grins and fist bumps, their adrenaline palpable. She might as well have been the ground itself. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach churn. Good thing Kincaid isn't flying with us, Miller muttered to Davies, loud enough for her to hear. No offense, but I wouldn't trust someone who's always glued to a desk to handle a hot zone. Too much theory, not enough real-world grit. She's sharp, Davies conceded. I'll give her that. But they're sharp, and there's the kind of instinct you need when you've got SAMs locking on. Plus, her flight hours are practically non-existent in active combat zones. We need pilots who live and breathe the danger. Valerie pretended not to hear, but the words burned. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times since she'd been effectively grounded 8 months prior. Too cautious, they said. Too methodical, others claimed. Too much of a liability, was the unspoken judgment that truly stung. It didn't matter that her precision landings were flawless, that her evasive maneuvers and simulations were textbook perfect, or that she could identify enemy radar signatures faster than anyone in the squadron. When it came to dangerous assignments, she was always deemed insufficient. The worst part was that she understood their reasoning, at least superficially. In a life-or-death aerial dogfight, raw courage and split-second aggression mattered. But it wasn't everything, and she'd never been given the chance to prove that her meticulous planning, her determination, her absolute refusal to quit might be worth more than impulsive bravado. Her grounding had been a quiet, insidious process. It wasn't an official reprimand or a disciplinary action. It started subtly, with her flight hours being reduced. Then, more senior pilots being assigned to missions she felt qualified for. Soon, it became clear. Captain Valerie Kincaid, one of the most promising young pilots in her class, was being sidelined, confined to the control tower, her wings clipped. The official reason was, quote, strategic reallocation of personnel, but everyone knew it was because of an incident 6 months ago during a high-stakes training exercise. She had identified a critical flaw in the simulated enemy's air defense grid and, against direct orders to maintain formation, had broken off to exploit it, successfully neutralizing the primary threat but also briefly exposing her wingman to a simulated counterattack. The exercise was a resounding success, but the commanding officer deemed her actions reckless and insubordinate. Your initiative nearly compromised the mission, Kincaid. Major Harding had lectured, his face inches from hers. We operate as a unit. You don't freelance in the air, not ever. Since then, she'd been meticulously careful, following every order to the letter, hoping to earn back their trust. But it seemed to have the opposite effect. Her adherence to protocol was now seen as a lack of boldness, her quiet efficiency as a lack of leadership potential. She was a brilliant tactician, a masterful mechanic, but they saw her only as a paper pilot. As the Viper jets prepared for departure, Valerie walked to the flight operations room and pulled out her personal gear. Hidden beneath regulation flight logs was a detailed satellite map of Sector 7 she'd been working on for weeks. Every night after her official duties ended, she studied satellite imagery, real-time weather patterns, and recent enemy movements. She'd memorized every ridge, every wadi, every potential ambush point within a 100-mile radius. Nobody had asked her to do this. Nobody knew she was doing it. But Valerie had learned long ago that being ready for opportunity was the only way to create it. The jets lifted off at 0730, their engines thundering across the base as they disappeared into the morning sky. Valerie stood on the tarmac, watching until there were just specks against the mountains, then turned back to her assigned duties. She had manifests to update, comms to monitor, and a growing sense that today would be different. She just didn't know how different yet. 3 weeks had passed since the, quote, Desert Shadow mission, a successful interdiction that had earned the flight crew commendations, and Valerie another day of updating flight logs. She'd watched the celebration from across the mess hall, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to ignore the familiar ache in her chest. The whispers had started immediately after the jets returned, not about the mission itself, but about her. Valerie first noticed it during the post-mission debrief when Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, from the Inspector General's office, a stern-faced officer known for his meticulous and often brutal assessments, asked her to verify the mission's communication logs. Simple enough, except his tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "You're sure about these comms records, Captain Kincaid?" Hayes had asked, tapping the screen with his pen. "Because if there's any discrepancy, any missing chatter, it's going to be a serious problem." Valerie had double-checked everything twice. The records were correct, as they always were. But Hayes's doubt planted a seed that began to grow throughout the base. Soon other small incidents followed. Her maintenance reports were questioned more thoroughly. Her requests for access to advanced flight simulators took longer to process, sometimes disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. During physical training, she caught sidelong glances when she outperformed expectations, as if her competence was somehow suspicious. The breaking point came during a routine briefing about base security protocols, one she was supposed to be leading on comms protocols. Valerie sat in her usual spot near the front, preparing to present new equipment check procedures, when she overheard her name mentioned in a conversation 2 rows behind her. "I'm just saying Kincaid spends a lot of time poring over those strategic maps," Private Chen, a ground crew technician, was whispering to his neighbor, "more than someone on tactical comms really needs to." "What's that supposed to mean?" The other soldier replied, "Maybe nothing, but she's always asking questions about flight patterns, enemy radar, stuff that's not really her job. Makes you wonder what she's really up to." Valerie's hand froze on her tablet. She stared at the back of Chen's head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Her dedication to understanding the area of operations, something that made her better at her job, even her limited support role, was being twisted into something questionable. After the briefing, she cornered Chen near the supply depot. "Is there something you want to say to me directly, Private?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Chen looked uncomfortable, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Look, Captain Kincaid, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, you have to admit you're pretty intense about stuff that's not exactly your specialty. My specialty is ensuring the safety and efficiency of this unit's air operations. Private, Valerie replied, her voice gaining a sharp edge. That means understanding every variable that could affect a mission, from comms integrity to enemy threat profiles. I'm sorry if my thoroughness makes you uncomfortable. Hey, don't get defensive, Chen mumbled, backing away slightly. I'm just saying, maybe you should focus on what you're actually assigned to do instead of trying to play pilot. The words hit like a physical blow. Valerie had spent 8 months proving herself, had earned a reputation for meticulousness and dedication, and now that was being questioned because she cared too much about doing her job well, even if it wasn't the job she truly wanted. She walked away without another word, but the damage was done. Over the following days, she noticed more changes. Her suggestions during briefings were met with polite dismissal. Her requests for additional flight hours, even in training simulators, were quietly denied. Even her friend, Lieutenant Miller, one of the few pilots who still occasionally sought her advice on technical matters, seemed to be keeping his distance. The isolation grew worse when Major Harding called her into his office for what he termed a, quote, performance review. Valerie sat across from his desk, her service record spread out between them like evidence in a trial. Captain Kincaid, you're technically proficient, Harding began, his fingers drumming against the desk. Your attention to detail is comprehensive, but there have been some concerns raised about your focus. What kind of concerns, sir? Valerie asked, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. The kind that suggest you might be more interested in duties outside your assigned role, Harding continued, his eyes narrowed. I need to know that my tactical comms personnel are focused on comms, not distracted by flight operations they're not qualified for. Valerie felt something cold settle in her stomach. Sir, I've never neglected my assigned duties. My performance reviews have been consistently excellent. That's not the issue. The issue is scope, Harding interjected, leaning forward. You're studying enemy air defense grids, pilot maneuver protocols, even theoretical engagement strategies, all things that fall outside your area of responsibility. It's creating questions about your intentions. My intentions are to be the best officer I can be, sir. To be ready for whatever the mission requires, Valerie stated, meeting his gaze directly. Harding leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that seemed to weigh her worth. The mission requires you to ensure clear communications and accurate flight manifests, Kincaid. Nothing more. I'm going to need you to scale back the extracurricular activities. Focus on what you're here for. Valerie left the office feeling like she'd been punched in the gut. Her dedication was being treated as a character flaw, her preparation as potential insubordination. She was being systematically pushed into a smaller and smaller box, told to limit herself to the narrow role others had decided she was suited for. That night, she sat in her quarters, staring at the detailed satellite map she'd been working on. Months of careful study, notes on enemy radar blind spots, elevation charts for low-altitude ingress, potential hazard zones, all of it dismissed as inappropriate ambition. She thought about putting them away, about accepting the limitations others had placed on her. Instead, she folded them carefully and tucked them into her personal gear. If today had taught her anything, it was that being ready wasn't just about opportunity. It was about survival. The call came in at 11:43 on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Valerie was updating inventory logs for spare engine parts in the supply depot when the emergency klaxon shattered the routine quiet of the base. She dropped her clipboard and ran toward the command center, her heart hammering against her ribs. The radio chatter was chaotic, filled with static and overlapping voices. Through the noise, she caught fragments that made her blood turn cold. Viper 1 hit, multiple bogeys. Sector 7, pilot unresponsive. Viper 2 disengaging. Cobra 3 under heavy fire. Valerie pushed through the gathering crowd of personnel until she could see the command center's main display. A cluster of red dots blinked furiously on the digital map, marking the last known positions of the fighter jets in some of the most treacherous, enemy-controlled airspace in the region. She recognized the area immediately. She'd studied those coordinates for weeks, knew every wadi, every hidden radar installation, every potential ambush point. Major Harding stood at the center of the controlled chaos, his face grim as he coordinated the response. Viper 2, report status, Harding barked into his comms unit. Sir, Viper 1 is down. Miller's unresponsive. We took heavy damage from a ground-to-air missile, Captain Davies' voice crackled through the radio, strained with panic and adrenaline. Cobra 3 is attempting to draw fire, but we're outmatched. 3 enemy MiGs, maybe 4, converging on our position. Cobra 3, maintain evasive maneuvers. Viper 2, disengage and return to base. We can't afford to lose more aircraft, Harding commanded, his voice tight with desperation. Sir, we can't just leave Miller, Davies protested. He's a sitting duck, Davies. Get out of there, Kincaid. Get me a recovery plan. What's Miller's last known trajectory? Harding demanded, turning his attention to Valerie. Valerie's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up Miller's flight data. He was attempting a low-altitude evasion, sir, just before he went unresponsive. Impact likely in Grid 7 Omega, a narrow canyon system. High-density enemy AAA coverage. Then a ground extraction is impossible, air rescue is suicide, Harding muttered, running a hand through his hair. What about a close air support run to suppress enemy anti-air? Cobra 3, can you provide cover for a recovery attempt? Negative, sir. Captain Chen's voice broke through, ragged with exhaustion. We're almost out of ordnance and fuel. These MiGs are relentless. We're being forced to disengage. They're pushing us back to the border. The command center fell into a grim silence, broken only by the frantic beeps of radar systems and the distant roar of engines as Viper 2 and Cobra 3 limped away, leaving their fallen comrade behind. Valerie watched the red dot, marking Miller's last position. She knew that canyon. She'd analyzed it for hours, identifying weak points in its natural defenses, theoretical ingress and egress routes that no one else had considered. It was a death trap for any standard rescue attempt, but she knew a way that involved flying. She stepped forward, her voice clear despite the chaos around her. Sir, I know that canyon. A direct air approach is impossible, but I believe I can get to him. Harding turned, his expression shifting from intense focus to irritation. Kincaid, this is not the time for, I need solutions, not fantasies. Sir, I've mapped every wadi and ridge in Sector 7, including Miller's last known trajectory. The standard approach is impossible, but a highly specialized, low-altitude ingress through the Serpent Spine passage could work. It's a risk, but it bypasses the primary anti-air nests. I can get a jet in there. Are you out of your mind? Thompson, a logistics officer, interjected, incredulous. That passage is barely wide enough for a training drone, and even if you got in, you'd be flying blind with enemy jets still in the area. I've simulated the flight path dozens of times, Valerie said quietly, her eyes fixed on Harding. In the simulator, I've flown it with zero visibility and under heavy fire. I can make it. The command center fell silent, except for the desperate static of radio communications, still searching for a sign of Miller. Every eye turned toward Valerie, most filled with disbelief, others with something approaching pity. Harding's voice was dangerously quiet. Kincaid, you're a tactical comms specialist. You're not qualified for combat air patrols, much less a solo rescue operation into a hot zone. I am qualified to fly a combat jet, sir. I'm qualified to navigate terrain in zero visibility. I'm qualified to execute precision maneuvers under pressure, Valerie countered, her voice gaining strength. And I know that canyon and that enemy airspace better than anyone in this room. You're grounded, Kincaid, Major Harding's voice boomed. No offense, but your flight record in active combat zones is non-existent. We need experienced combat pilots up there, not someone who spent the last 8 months behind a desk. Physics doesn't care about your simulations. Valerie felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but this time it was different. This time there was a pilot dying in that canyon, likely targeted by 3 enemy jets still patrolling the area, while everyone stood around debating whether she was bold enough, experienced enough, or even physically capable enough to save him. Sir, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, give me a chance. If I can't make the ingress, you've lost nothing more than a jet and a pilot you've already written off. If I can, you save a life, you save a fighter jet, and you might just turn the tide against those MiGs. Harding studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. Absolutely not. I won't risk losing another asset on a suicide mission. We wait for Cobra 3 and Viper 2 to refuel and rearm. We send a full squadron. They'll be ready in 6 hours. 6 hours might be too long, sir, Valerie pressed, her urgency growing. Pilot Miller is down, possibly injured, and those enemy jets are still active. Every minute we delay reduces his chances of survival and leaves those MiGs unchallenged. That's not your call to make, Kincaid. You're dismissed. The words hit like a slap. Valerie stared at Harding, at the faces around her filled with doubt and dismissal, at the blinking red dot on the screen representing a man who might die because she wasn't deemed worthy of trying to save him. She turned and walked out of the command center, her boots silent on the concrete floor. Behind her, the planning continued, filled with logistical complications and technological solutions that would take hours to implement, hours that Pilot Miller didn't have. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In her quarters, Valerie sat on her cot and stared at her hands. They weren't the calloused, oil-stained hands of a mechanic or the thick, strong hands of a ground soldier. They were precise, nimble hands, honed by countless hours on flight sticks and intricate system repairs. Too small, everyone always pointed out, too delicate to control a fighter jet under G-forces, too soft to matter when lives were on the line. She thought about Captain Miller, whom she'd served with for 8 months. He'd never dismissed her, never made her feel small. He treated her like a pilot, like someone whose opinion mattered. And now he was dying in a canyon, possibly under enemy fire, because she wasn't considered capable enough to try to save him. Valerie stood up and began gathering her gear. Not the standard flight suit and helmet they'd eventually bring to the crash site if a full squadron was deployed, but her personal flight gear, the specialized lightweight helmet with enhanced comms she'd modified herself, the custom-fit G-suit, and the worn, comfortable flight gloves she'd used in every simulator she'd ever flown. Gear that no one knew she had because no one thought she'd ever need it. She'd spent 8 months being told she wasn't enough. Today, she was going to prove them wrong. Valerie waited until the base settled into its evening routine before making her move. The command center was still active, but most of the personnel had shifted to support roles, monitoring communications and coordinating with the air wing that wouldn't launch until morning. She'd heard the latest updates. Miller's emergency beacon was still active, but his vital signs were growing weaker, and enemy air patrols in Sector 7 were intensifying, making any rescue attempt even more perilous. She slipped out of her quarters with her flight bag loaded and her mind crystal clear. The route she'd memorized led through a service road that connected to the main hangars, then branched into a taxiway that would take her to the farthest reaches of the airbase. She'd walked it dozens of times during her off-duty hours, timing herself, learning every shadow and blind spot. The first challenge came at the motor pool checkpoint. Sergeant Ramirez sat in the guard shack, his attention focused on a paperback novel. Valerie approached with her standard confident stride, a clipboard in hand, as if she was conducting a routine inspection. "Evening, Sergeant," she said, not slowing down, just checking the fuel levels on the backup generators for Hangar 7. Ramirez glanced up, saw her flight operations vest and familiar face, and nodded without interest. "Make it quick, Kincaid. I'm not supposed to let anyone wander around after 2,000 hours. "Just need 5 minutes," she replied, already moving past the checkpoint. Her heart hammered, but her voice remained steady. 5 minutes was all she needed to reach the perimeter fence. The base security was designed to keep threats out, not to keep personnel in. Valerie found the maintenance gate she'd noticed weeks ago, partially hidden behind an equipment storage container. The lock was standard military issue, nothing that couldn't be bypassed with the right tools and enough patience. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. The lock clicked open. After 2 minutes of careful manipulation, she slipped through the gate and onto the deserted taxiway beyond, knowing that she had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her target was the maintenance hangar at the far end of the base, where a spare F-16 Viper was undergoing routine diagnostics. It wasn't fully combat-ready, but it was airworthy, and more importantly, it was overlooked. This particular F-16, designated Sparrow Hawk, had been plagued with minor sensor glitches for weeks, keeping it out of the active rotation. But Valerie knew those systems intimately. She'd personally calibrated its targeting array during her unscheduled logistics checks. The flight to the canyon would take less than an hour, but the approach would be through terrain that most pilots would consider impassable in daylight. Valerie had studied the route obsessively, memorizing every landmark, every potential hazard. She'd also prepared for the possibility that she might not make it back. In her flight bag, along with her personal gear and minimal survival supplies, was a letter addressed to her sister back in Colorado. In it, she tried to explain why she'd made this choice, why she couldn't stand by and watch someone die when she might be able to help. The letter was probably unnecessary. She fully intended to return with Miller. But it felt important to acknowledge the stakes. As she sprinted across the tarmac, Valerie's mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard earlier between Thompson and Davies. They'd been discussing contingency plans, speculating about how long Miller might survive in the canyon. Neither had mentioned the possibility of her unauthorized rescue attempt. Because neither could conceive of her attempting something so far outside her assigned role, that was her advantage. Everyone at the base saw her as Logistics Kincaid, the meticulous woman who counted equipment and filed reports. They couldn't imagine her soloing an F-16 into a hostile canyon, much less facing down 3 enemy MiGs. Their dismissal had become her camouflage. The hangar bay was dimly lit, echoing with the hum of ventilation systems. Sparrow sat alone, its sleek form a silent promise of raw power. Valerie moved with practiced efficiency, her training kicking in. She bypassed the security systems she knew intimately, slipping into the cockpit. The familiar scent of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid filled her senses. This was her element. Her hands, supposedly too small, moved with swift precision across the controls, initiating pre-flight checks. Powering up the engines, the roar that filled the hangar was a symphony to her ears. It was the sound of defiance, of proving them all wrong. The ground crew, oblivious to her presence, was finishing up their shift. Valerie timed her taxi perfectly, blending into the routine departure of a cargo plane from an adjacent hangar. The control tower, operating on a skeleton crew for the late shift, didn't question the F-16's unexpected movement. To them, it was likely just another late-night maintenance test flight, something not uncommon on large bases. As the F-16 reached the runway, Valerie felt a surge of adrenaline that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of truly flying, not just in simulations. And now, she was doing it, albeit under the most extreme and unauthorized circumstances. Base, this is Sparrowhawk, requesting immediate takeoff clearance. Routine systems check. Valerie's voice was calm, professional, masking the tremor of anticipation. There was a brief pause from the tower. Sparrowhawk, this is Tower. We show no scheduled flight for your tail number. Confirm your request. Valerie knew this was the moment of truth. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Negative, Tower. Urgent systems anomaly detected. Immediate flight required for diagnostics. Stand by for takeoff. She didn't wait for a response. The throttle slammed forward, the F-16 surging down the runway with a deafening roar. In seconds, she was airborne, pulling the fighter jet into a steep, defiant climb. The lights of Base Falcon shrank beneath her, disappearing into the vast expanse of the night desert. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as she approached Sector 7. The satellite imagery had shown her the general layout, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The desert gave way to jagged mountains, their peaks like saw blades against the pre-dawn sky. Her target, the Serpent Spine Canyon, appeared as a black slit in the earth, a death trap for any pilot not intimately familiar with its every turn. Valerie activated her enhanced night vision and external sensors, pushing the F-16 to its limits. The approach was the most technically challenging part. The canyon entrance was barely wider than her wingspan, flanked by towering rock faces that created treacherous wind currents. Valerie flew low, hugging the contours of the earth, relying on the mental maps she had etched into her mind. Her training kicked in muscle memory from thousands of hours in the simulator, where she'd pushed virtual jets through impossible gaps and evaded imaginary threats. They saw her as too cautious for real-world flying, so she'd kept her true capabilities hidden. Now, those hidden skills were the difference between life and death. As she plunged into the canyon, the air became turbulent, buffeting the F-16 violently. Her radar lit up with multiple contacts. the enemy MiGs still patrolling the area, searching for any sign of Miller or any new target. Valerie switched off her active radar, relying solely on passive sensors and visual cues. She was a ghost in the canyon, a whisper in the wind. The silence from her own base radio was deafening. They would have realized by now that Sparrowhawk was gone, that she was gone. The alarms would be blaring. Harding would be furious. But it didn't matter. She was committed now, suspended between the ground and the sky with nothing but determination and meticulously planned preparation to bridge the gap. Above her, somewhere in the darkness, Miller was waiting for someone to prove that caution and precision didn't equate to weakness. Valerie looked at the swirling green of her night vision display, charting the treacherous path ahead, and smiled grimly. Time to show them what too small could accomplish. Suddenly, a warning blared in her helmet. "Missile lock! Missile lock!" 3 red diamonds flashed on her HUD, indicating multiple inbound threats. The enemy MiGs had detected her. They were closing fast. The F-16 screamed through the narrow canyon as Valerie initiated a series of aggressive evasive maneuvers, pulling the stick hard to the right, then left, leveraging the canyon walls for cover. The missile lock alarm became a continuous shriek in her ears. She knew the canyon's every twist and turn, every natural choke point that could break a lock or force an enemy pilot into a fatal error. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was a desperate dogfight, an aerial ballet of death in a space meant for ground vehicles. 3 enemy jets confirmed, she muttered to herself, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos in the cockpit. Her tactical display showed the 3 MiG-29s, state-of-the-art enemy fighters, closing in rapidly. They were faster, more heavily armed, and they had her outnumbered. But they didn't have her knowledge of this terrain. Valerie pushed the F-16 to its limits, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat. She flew a terrifyingly low altitude, skimming the canyon floor, forcing the MiGs to either climb to avoid crashing or follow her into the treacherous confined space. One of the MiGs, more aggressive than the others, took the bait. Its pilot, confident in his aircraft's superior agility and numbers, plunged into the canyon behind her. "Fox 2!" Valerie heard a guttural yell over the enemy radio frequency, a brief, clear transmission that confirmed a heat-seeking missile launch. She saw the bright plume of the missile ignite in her rearview, streaking toward her. "Chaff! Flares!" Her thumb slammed down on the countermeasures button. A burst of aluminum strips and bright hot flares erupted from her jet, creating a chaotic display of false targets. The missile, confused, veered off course, exploding harmlessly against a rock face behind her. The pursuing MiG, however, wasn't so lucky. Its pilot, focused on her, failed to account for the sudden turbulence and narrow confines. Valerie executed a hairpin turn around a sharp bend in the canyon, using the momentary cover of the rock. The MiG, unable to match her impossible maneuver, clipped its wing on the canyon wall. A blinding flash, then a secondary explosion as the jet disintegrated into a fireball, scattering debris against the ancient rocks. "Splash 1, Valerie said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. 1 down, 2 to go, but she knew this was only the beginning. The remaining 2 MiGs, now more cautious, pulled up out of the canyon, attempting to box her in from above. They launched multiple missiles, trying to bracket her. Valerie weaved, dipped, and climbed within the canyon, using its natural labyrinth as her shield. The missile warnings were constant, the explosions against the canyon walls, a terrifying serenade. Her fuel gauge was dropping, her ammunition was limited. She had 2 air-to-air missiles remaining, meant for self-defense, not a prolonged dogfight against superior numbers. This wasn't about surviving. It was about buying time, about creating an opening to reach Miller, and about somehow making it out alive. The radio chatter in her earpiece had grown increasingly frantic. Base Command was coordinating multiple search efforts, but they were all far from her current position, unaware of the aerial ballet of death she was conducting. "Sparrowhawk, respond! Kincaid, if you can hear this, return to base immediately. That's a direct order." Major Harding's voice was sharp with authority and growing concern. Valerie switched off her radio. She'd known this moment would come, when her absence would be discovered and her actions would be considered insubordination. But she'd also known that some things were more important than following orders, especially when those orders meant watching someone die. The remaining MiGs, learning from their comrade's mistake, adopted a new tactic. They split, one flying high, attempting to spot her from above, the other circling the canyon entrance, ready to intercept if she tried to escape. Valerie knew she couldn't outrun them in the long term, and she couldn't engage them both at once in a fair fight. She needed to use the terrain and her cunning. She needed to lure them. She saw the faint flicker of Miller's emergency beacon deeper in the canyon, a faint pulse that guided her. It was close, too close to give up now. She angled her jet, presenting a tempting target, then suddenly pitched down, disappearing behind a particularly jagged rock formation. One of the MiGs, the one circling high, took the bait, diving to confirm her position. As it committed to the dive, Valerie pulled an almost impossible Immelman turn, bringing her F-16 roaring up behind the unsuspecting enemy. "Fox 2!" she yelled, launching her first missile. The MiG pilot, caught off guard, barely had time to react. The missile struck its engine, sending the aircraft spiraling out of control before exploding in a ball of fire. "Splash 2," Valerie whispered, her breath ragged. Now it was one-on-one. The final MiG, its pilot likely filled with a mixture of rage and terror, launched every missile it had, a desperate, final volley. Valerie broke hard, pulling negative Gs, pushing her jet through a dizzying array of maneuvers she'd only dared attempt in simulations. Flares and chaff streamed behind her as the missiles streaked past, missing by mere feet. She knew she couldn't afford to get into a turning fight with the last MiG. Her fuel was critically low, and she had only one missile left. She needed to reach Miller, and she needed to do it now. Pushing the throttle to max afterburner, Valerie raced deeper into the canyon, the MiG a furious shadow on her tail. She could see it now, the wreckage of Miller's F-16, a twisted broken bird wedged precariously against the canyon wall, and beside it, a figure. Miller was alive. Just as she spotted him, her radar lit up again. The last MiG, relentless, had found an angle. "Missile lock! Missile lock!" Valerie didn't hesitate. She launched her last missile not at the MiG, but directly into a narrow, unstable rock overhang above the enemy jet. The explosion ripped through the rock, sending a cascade of boulders and debris tumbling down the canyon. The MiG, caught in the sudden rock slide, was overwhelmed. Its pilot, no doubt disoriented and attempting to avoid the falling rock, lost control. With a final, sickening crunch, it slammed into the canyon floor. "Splash 3," Valerie declared, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and triumph. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own engine. The 3 enemy jets were gone. She had cleared the skies. But her mission wasn't over. She had to save Miller. With the skies finally clear of hostile threats, a tense silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by the hum of Sparrowhawk's engines and the faint rhythmic pulse of Captain Miller's emergency beacon. Valerie's attention snapped back to her primary objective, getting Miller out. His F-16 was a mangled, unrecognizable mess, its fuselage crumpled against the coax. Sheer rock face, a testament to the brutal impact it had sustained. The cockpit, once a sleek, armored bubble, was now open to the elements, a twisted maw of shattered metal and broken glass. Miller's beacon, agonizingly close on her display, was the only unwavering sign of life amidst the devastation. Valerie carefully maneuvered Sparrowhawk, pushing past the lingering smoke and the scattered debris of the downed MiGs. This was perhaps the most delicate, precision flying she had ever attempted. The F-16 was a magnificent machine designed for speed, agility, and combat dominance, not for hovering like a helicopter or conducting delicate rescue operations in such unforgiving, confined spaces. Every fractional adjustment of the stick, every whisper of throttle, had to be perfect. The narrow canyon walls loomed on either side, their jagged edges seemingly reaching out to snag her wings, while the unpredictable air currents threatened to toss her into an unforgiving embrace of rock and metal. Her internal sensors confirmed it. Miller was still clinging to life. His vital signs, displayed faintly on her HUD, were weak and erratic, but they were there. His cockpit canopy was completely gone, leaving him exposed to the harsh desert night. The forward section of his jet was deeply embedded in the rock, pinning him in place. Landing was a non-starter. There was simply no flat surface, no patch of ground wide enough to accommodate even a fractional part of her landing gear. She needed to extract him directly from the air, a maneuver considered suicidal by most. impossible by all. This was where her clandestine, unauthorized modifications to Sparrowhawk would either prove her genius or cement her madness. In the solitude of many late nights, fueled by caffeine and an almost obsessive dedication, Valerie had reinforced a rarely used utility winch system in the F-16's belly. Originally designed for retrieving small, unmanned drones or deploying specialized reconnaissance pods, she had meticulously upgraded its hydraulics, strengthened its cable, and recalibrated its lifting capacity for heavier loads. It was a long shot, a gamble born of desperate foresight, but it was their only chance. Valerie flipped a series of switches, her fingers moving with an almost surgical precision. A low, mechanical groan vibrated through the jet as the modified winch system whirred to life. Below, a slender, reinforced cable, gleaming faintly in the pale moonlight, began to unspool, slowly extending towards the wreckage, a fragile lifeline in the vast darkness. She activated the F-16's high-definition external camera, an advanced optic she'd personally sourced and painstakingly installed. The live feed, projected onto her HUD, showed a stark, unforgiving view of Miller's downed jet. She had to guide that cable, with absolute, unwavering precision, directly into his cockpit. "Miller," she tried, her voice tight with concentration, over the open emergency frequency, knowing deep down that he likely couldn't hear her. "Can you hear me? This is Kincaid. I'm here. Hold on, just hold on." There was no response, only the relentless, desperate beeping of his beacon, a tiny pulse of hope in the vast silence. He was unconscious, likely severely injured, perhaps beyond recognition. She had to assume the worst and work with what she had. There was no time for doubt, no room for error. She nudged the F-16 inch by agonizing inch, fighting the turbulent air currents that snatched at her wings. The cable swayed wildly, a pendulum against the backdrop of the wreckage, then slowly, steadily, descended towards Miller's slumped form in the cockpit. Her eyes, glued to the camera feed, meticulously tracked the grappling hook attached to the end of the cable. She had to latch it onto something secure, his ejection seat frame, a reinforced section of his flight harness. One wrong move, one errant gust, and the cable could snag, tangle beyond recovery, or, worst of all, strike him, turning rescue into disaster. It was a pilot's version of threading a needle from 1,000 feet away, in a hurricane, in the dark. Finally, after what felt like an eternity stretched thin by adrenaline, the grappling hook swung close. Valerie held her breath, her fingers trembling ever so slightly on the controls, and then, with a soft, resonant thud she felt more than saw, it latched. The camera feed confirmed it, a secure connection. She pulled back slightly on the winch, testing the connection. It held. "Got him," she whispered, a ragged breath escaping her lips as a wave of desperate relief, so potent it almost buckled her, washed over her. Now came the impossible part, lifting him out. The F-16 was fundamentally not designed to hoist a human being from a fixed position, especially not one that was potentially pinned under tons of twisted metal. Valerie had calculated the stresses, reinforced the winch, tested it with dead weight in simulations, but theoretical mechanics were one thing, the brutal reality of a live rescue another. She began to slowly, painstakingly reel in the cable, every stress indicator on her display flickering ominously. The F-16 groaned, its frame shuddering under the immense, uncharacteristic strain. Miller's body began to lift, slowly, agonizingly, from the wreckage. There was a metallic shriek as a piece of twisted fuselage tore away, then a sickening sound of tearing fabric as his G-suit snagged on a sharp edge. Valerie held her breath. Every muscle in her body tensed. But the harness, a standard issue modified for quick attachment, held firm. Just as Miller was finally clear of the wreckage, suspended precariously below her, a new, unwelcome threat blared to life on her internal comms. "Base command to Sparrowhawk. Identify yourself. You are in restricted airspace. Return to base immediately or be considered hostile. This is a direct order." It was Major Harding's voice, laced with a potent mix of furious incredulity and dawning realization. Her unauthorized flight had been confirmed. She was no longer just grounded. She was, officially, a rogue pilot. Valerie didn't respond. She couldn't. Her entire focus, her every fiber of being, was consumed by Miller's unconscious form, gently reeling him up, praying the winch would hold, that the F-16's overstressed systems wouldn't fail, that the canyon walls wouldn't suddenly reach out and claim them both. Slowly, painstakingly, she guided Miller's limp form until he was secure within the F-16's modified utility bay, a tight fit, almost claustrophobic, but enough to hold him safely. She sealed the bay, securing him as best she could for the perilous flight back. "Miller's secured," she transmitted, her voice breaking with exhaustion but clear and resolute, over the general base frequency, returning to base. "Repeat, Miller secured, returning to base." She then immediately cut off her comms again, plunging the cockpit into a new, self-imposed silence. She didn't want to hear the inevitable recriminations, the demands for explanation, the threats of disciplinary action. She still had to fly them both out of this hellish canyon and all the way back to Base Falcon. The flight out of Sector 7 was as challenging, if not more so, than the ingress. With Captain Miller secured in the modified utility bay, the F-16's balance was significantly off, its handling sluggish and unpredictable. It felt like flying a pregnant elephant through a needle, a far cry from the sleek, agile fighter jet she knew. Valerie compensated with every ounce of her practiced skill, her hands instinctively adjusting to the altered aerodynamics, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals. She navigated the Serpent's spine in reverse, every turn, every ascent, every breath a calculated risk. The absence of enemy jets, a consequence of her earlier desperate dogfight, was a small mercy, but the damaged jet and its precarious, priceless cargo made every second a test of her resolve, every bump of turbulence a jolt to her already frayed nerves. As she cleared the jagged peaks of the mountains and broke into open airspace, the full crushing weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. She had stolen a military aircraft, a multi-million-dollar asset. She had blatantly disobeyed direct orders from her commanding officer. She had engaged in unauthorized combat, flying solo into a hot zone, and she had risked her life and Miller's on an improbable, unapproved rescue mission. The consequences would be severe, unavoidable. A court-martial was almost a certainty, a guaranteed end to her military career. The meticulous path she had carved out for herself, the years of relentless training and sacrifice, all leading to this moment, now seemed destined to culminate in dishonor. But Miller was alive. He was breathing. That, she knew with every fiber of her being, was all that truly mattered. The familiar lights of Base Falcon appeared on the horizon, a sprawling beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. As she approached, the base radio crackled to life, this time with a calmer but equally authoritative tone. It was the air traffic controller, his voice strained but professional. "Sparrowhawk, this is Base Tower. You are cleared for immediate landing on runway 3. Emergency teams are standing by. Repeat, emergency teams standing by. Maintain radio silence until directed." The last directive was a clear indication that while they were preparing for her, they weren't about to engage in pleasantries. The phrase "emergency team standing by" didn't imply a triumphant welcome. It implied readiness for a crash, for disaster, for the final, chaotic act of a rogue pilot. Valerie brought the F-16 down with a feather-light touch, a testament to her extraordinary piloting skills even under immense pressure. It was a perfect landing, despite the jet's significant imbalance and the lingering damage. As the wheels kissed the tarmac, the runway was instantly bathed in the blinding glare of emergency lights, flashing red and blue from ambulances, the harsh white of fire trucks, and the piercing spotlights of military police vehicles. The base looked less like a peaceful operations hub, and more like a scene from a disaster movie. She taxied Sparrowhawk to the designated emergency zone, its engines spooling down with a final, mournful whine. The sudden, profound silence in the cockpit was almost deafening after the hours of roaring engines, blaring alarms, and her own racing heartbeat. The instant the canopy hissed open, a swarm of personnel descended upon the jet. Medics, their faces grim and efficient, rushed to the utility bay, carefully unsecuring and extracting Captain Miller. Valerie watched, her breath catching in her throat as they quickly assessed him, loaded him onto a stretcher, and rushed him towards a waiting ambulance. He was pale, covered in dust and dried blood, but he was breathing. His chest rose and fell, visibly. He was alive. Then came the officers. Major Harding was at the front, his face a mask of furious relief, a complex blend of anger, disbelief, and a flicker of something akin to awe. Beside him stood Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the Inspector General's office, his expression grim, unyielding, a judicial stone against the emotional storm. Two heavily armed military police officers immediately moved to flank Valerie's cockpit, their presence a stark, unmistakable symbol of her situation. "Captain Kincaid," Harding's voice was low, strained with barely contained anger, each word clipped and precise. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. You are under arrest for insubordination, unauthorized flight, and theft of military property. You will be escorted to temporary confinement." Valerie, stiff from the grueling flight but holding herself with every ounce of dignity she could muster, climbed out of the cockpit. Her flight suit was damp with sweat, her hair matted, but her back was ramrod straight. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline hangover and the crushing weight of impending doom. She looked past Harding to the ambulance, its sirens now wailing faintly as it sped towards the base hospital, carrying Miller away. "Is he stable, sir? Will he make a full recovery?" Harding's jaw worked, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He hesitated for a long moment, a testament to the conflicting emotions warring within him. "He's alive, Kincaid," he finally managed, his voice still tight. "Thanks to your reckless, unauthorized, and utterly unbelievable stunt. He's got a long road ahead, but he'll make it. The medics say you got to him just in time." "Then it was worth it, sir," Valerie stated, meeting his gaze directly, her conviction unwavering. The words were a quiet defiance, a statement of principle that transcended the regulations she had broken. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his eyes dissecting her with a cold, piercing intensity. "Captain Kincaid, your actions tonight represent a complete and utter disregard for military protocol, chain of command, and the safety of personnel and assets. You have jeopardized not only your own life, but potentially an entire mission, and risked escalating a regional conflict with your unauthorized combat engagement. You have sullied the reputation of this base. You will be held accountable for every single regulation you shattered tonight." His voice was a flat, unyielding condemnation. "Sir, I understand the charges," Valerie responded, her voice unwavering, a steady counterpoint to his fury. "And I understand that Captain Miller is alive because of my actions. I also understand that 3 enemy MiGs, state-of-the-art combat aircraft, are no longer a threat, because I took action when no one else could." Hayes scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "You understand? Captain, in the military, you don't understand in that context. You obey. Your initiative could have led to a catastrophic diplomatic incident, or worse, another downed F-16 with far less fortunate outcome. Your personal conviction is irrelevant in the face of established military law." The military police officers, large and imposing, gently but firmly took her arms, their grip a stark reminder of her new status. As they led her away towards a temporary holding facility, she glanced back at Sparrowhawk, the F-16 that had been her lifeline, her escape, her instrument of defiance. It sat under the harsh spotlights, its frame still subtly smoking, a silent witness to the impossible rescue, a testament to what a grounded pilot could accomplish when pushed to her absolute limits. She was marched towards the desolate, utilitarian structure, the enormity of her situation finally settling in. She had done the impossible, but the cost, she knew, would be immense. Her career was gone, her freedom was uncertain. Yet, a quiet, fierce satisfaction burned in her chest. Miller was alive. The next few days blurred into a monotonous, suffocating cycle of interrogation. Valerie was held in a secure Spartan room within the base's temporary detention facility. The walls were bland, the air stale, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the base and the relentless ticking of a clock that seemed to mock the passage of time. She was subjected to endless questions from Major Harding, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, and a rotating cast of grim-faced officers from various departments, legal, operations, security. Each asked the same questions, delving into her motives, her meticulous preparation, her, quote, unauthorized modifications to the F-16, and her blatant, undeniable disregard for orders. "Captain Kincaid, do you understand the gravity of the charges against you?" Lieutenant Colonel Hayes would drone, his voice a low, insistent hum designed to wear down her resolve. Theft of military property, insubordination in the face of a direct order, unauthorized combat engagement, risking classified assets. These are serious offenses, Kincaid. Your career is over. You could face significant prison time, a dishonorable discharge. Do you grasp the implications? "Sir, I understand the charges," Valerie would reply, her voice weary but remarkably firm. Her conviction was a shield against their relentless probing. "And I understand that Captain Miller is alive because of my actions. I also understand that 3 enemy MiG-29s, advanced combat aircraft that posed an immediate threat to our airspace in future missions, are no longer operational because of my actions. I believe those outcomes outweigh any procedural infractions, sir." Her unwavering response typically elicited a frustrated sigh from Hayes, who clearly viewed her steady self-assurance as a sign of dangerous arrogance, a willful defiance of authority that needed to be crushed. Major Harding, however, seemed to listen differently. He was present for every interrogation, a silent observer whose true thoughts remained a mystery behind his stoic, military facade. Was he just doing his duty, adhering to protocol, or was there a flicker of something else in his eyes? A grudging respect, perhaps, or even a nascent admiration for her sheer audacity and competence. She couldn't tell, and she refused to let her hopes rise. Word of her solo rescue had spread like wildfire across the base, moving from whispers in the mess hall to hushed conversations in the barracks, eventually becoming the dominant topic of discussion. The whispers that had once dismissed her as too small or too cautious now carried a different tone: awe, disbelief, and a grudging respect for her undeniable skill. Even some of her harshest critics, like Captain Miller's former wingman, Davies, seemed to be reevaluating their opinions, their initial skepticism replaced by a begrudging acknowledgement of her heroism. She'd heard through the grapevine, from the few guards who treated her with quiet respect, that Miller himself, recovering in the base hospital, had insisted on speaking with Major Harding and later with even higher command. He recounted the impossible scenario he'd faced, the overwhelming odds, and the inexplicable, miraculous appearance of Sparrowhawk, a ghost in the canyon, saving his life. His testimony, she knew, would carry significant weight, coming from the very pilot she had saved. On the morning of the formal inquiry, Valerie was escorted from her cell to Major Harding's office. This was not a court-martial, not yet, but a preliminary hearing, a pivotal moment to determine the full scope of her actions and whether formal charges would proceed to a full military trial. When she entered, she found herself facing a tribunal of sorts, a panel of senior officers whose expressions would determine her fate. Besides Major Harding and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, there were 2 other high-ranking officers present, their uniforms crisp, their bearing imposing. First, Colonel Thorne, the formidable base commander, a man known for his strict adherence to rules but also for his deep loyalty to his personnel. Second, and most dauntingly, a stern-faced, grizzled Air Force general she didn't recognize, whose uniform bore more commendations and stars than she'd ever seen in person, a testament to a long, distinguished career. Their expressions ranged from outright stern disapproval to openly curious, almost analytical. "Captain Kincaid, please be seated," Colonel Thorne commanded, his voice deep and resonant, filling the small office. Valerie took the chair offered, the metal cold against her skin. Her uniform, meticulously pressed by her own hands in her cell, was crisp, a small act of defiance against the indignity of her situation. Despite the lack of sleep and the immense pressure she was under, she sat with a quiet dignity, her gaze steady. "Captain Kincaid," Colonel Thorne began, his gaze piercing, "you are here because your actions earlier this week created a significant, shall we say, disturbance for this command. You blatantly disobeyed direct orders, you willfully violated multiple base security protocols, and you conducted an unauthorized mission that could have resulted in your death, the tragic loss of a multi-million-dollar asset, and potentially escalated a sensitive regional conflict. That can believe." "Yes, sir," Valerie replied, her voice clear and unwavering, leaving no room for doubt or equivocation. However, Colonel Thorne continued, a slight, almost imperceptible pause in his voice, you also, against incredible odds, saved the life of a fellow pilot. And, perhaps more remarkably, you single-handedly neutralized 3 enemy aircraft that were operating with impunity in a high-threat zone, effectively clearing the airspace for potential future operations. The question we're here to address, Captain, is whether you are a disciplinary problem, a rogue element that must be excised from our ranks, or an underutilized asset, a valuable resource whose talents have been tragically misapplied. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, consulting a thick file that Valerie assumed contained her complete service record, along with a detailed report on her unscheduled F-16 modifications and the incident 6 months prior that had led to her grounding. He deliberately used her former, less prestigious rank as if to diminish her in the eyes of the senior officers. "Specialist Kincaid," he began, his voice laced with disdain, "can you explain why you felt authorized to ignore direct orders from your commanding officer? Do you not understand the concept of the chain of command of military discipline, of established procedure?" Valerie had rehearsed this moment in her mind throughout the sleepless nights, honing her answer, refining her arguments. She looked at the faces before her, at the formidable general, at the unrelenting Hayes, at the watchful Harding, and finally, at the discerning Colonel Thorne. "Sir," she began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying the weight of her conviction, "I believed, with absolute certainty, that Pilot Miller would die if I didn't act. I had the skills, the knowledge, and, as it turned out, the means necessary to reach him and to defend myself and him against the enemy forces that were actively hunting him. I believed that the potential benefit of saving his life and neutralizing a clear and present threat to our forces in that area outweighed the risks, and yes, the procedural infractions, of my unauthorized action. It was a calculated risk, sir, not a reckless one." "That's not your decision to make, Captain," Hayes interjected sharply, slamming his hand on the table, the sudden sound echoing in the room. "Military discipline exists for a reason, Captain. If every soldier decided for themselves which orders to follow based on their beliefs, we'd have chaos, not an effective fighting force. We would devolve into anarchy." "With respect, sir," Valerie said, meeting Hayes's angry gaze directly, her own conviction hardening, "I didn't decide to ignore orders lightly, sir. I spent months preparing for exactly this type of situation, for a contingency where conventional methods would fail, hoping I'd never need to use those skills. When the situation arose, when Captain Miller was downed and under active attack by superior enemy forces, and our ready aircraft were hours away from deployment, with no guaranteed success of reaching him in time, I was the only person on base who possessed the unique combination of knowledge, skill, and prepared resources to reach him in time to save his life and eliminate the immediate threat. My actions were not born of disrespect, but of desperation and a deep-seated commitment to my fellow soldiers." Major Harding, who had remained silent, now shuffled through papers on his desk, avoiding eye contact. "Speaking of preparation, Captain Kincaid," he said, his voice softer than Hayes's, but still formal, "your supervisors report that you've been studying materials and developing skills far beyond your assigned duties for quite some time. Some have questioned whether this represents inappropriate ambition or simply poor focus on your assigned role." Valerie felt a familiar, hot anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice controlled, modulated. "Sir, I believe that being a good officer, a good soldier, means being prepared for whatever the mission requires, not just for what is explicitly assigned. I studied enemy air tactics, practiced advanced flight maneuvers, and even learned to modify aircraft systems because I recognize that this base operates in a high-threat environment where those skills might be needed, regardless of my official designation as a tactical comms specialist. My focus has always been on mission success and the safety of my comrades." "But you're a tactical comms specialist, Kincaid," Hayes pointed out, his voice tinged with incredulity, as if repeating a simple, undeniable truth. "Your job is to ensure communication, to track equipment, not to conduct solo air combat operations, to engage enemy jets." "My job, sir," Valerie replied, her gaze firm, unwavering, locking onto the general's eyes, "is to serve my country and my fellow soldiers to the best of my ability. If that means expanding my capabilities beyond my assigned duties, beyond the narrow box others try to place me in, then that's what I'll do." especially when lives are on the line, and conventional wisdom says it can't be done. I saw a need, I had the means, and I acted. The room fell silent for a long moment, the only sound, the faint hum of the air conditioning. The tension was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. Then, the grizzled general, General Vance, who had been listening intently, his face unreadable, finally spoke. His voice was gravelly but resonated with authority, carrying the weight of decades of command. Captain Kincaid, your actions were undeniably successful this time. You accomplished the impossible. But they could have easily resulted in 2 casualties instead of 1, and potentially escalated an already volatile regional situation into something far more dangerous. How do you justify taking that monumental risk? Valerie had known this question would come. It was the ultimate test, the core philosophical debate of her actions. She took a deep breath. Sir, I calculated the risks as carefully as I could, given the urgency of the situation. I had the training, the unique equipment, and the knowledge necessary to attempt the rescue and the engagement successfully. The alternative was to watch Pilot Miller die while we waited for resources that might arrive too late, and to allow enemy forces to continue operating unchallenged in our airspace, potentially attacking other assets. I chose the path that offered the only chance for success. And if you had failed, Captain? Harding asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, echoing the thought that had haunted him for days. If you had crashed? If Miller had died anyway? If your actions had needlessly escalated the conflict and sparked a wider war? Then I would have failed attempting to save a life, sir, rather than succeeded at doing nothing, Valerie replied, her voice unwavering, filled with a quiet, fierce resolve. I can live with the consequences of trying. I couldn't live with the consequences of not trying, of standing by when I had the power to make a difference. The 3 officers and the general exchanged glances, a complex form of silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of military service. Finally, General Vance spoke, his tone more thoughtful now, less accusatory, carrying a note of profound finality. Captain Kincaid, your actions represent both the best and worst of military initiative. You showed extraordinary courage, exceptional skill, and unparalleled resourcefulness in saving a fellow soldier's life and neutralizing a significant threat. But you also showed a concerning, undeniable disregard for the chain of command and military discipline. Such a disregard cannot, under normal circumstances, be overlooked. Valerie's heart sank. She'd known this was coming. The preamble, the careful weighing of pros and cons, always led to the inevitable conclusion. She had prepared herself for court-martial, for discharge, for the ignominious end of her military career. But even as she braced herself, she also knew, with unwavering certainty, that she'd make the exact same choice again if faced with the exact same situation. However, General Vance continued, his voice cutting through her resigned thoughts, a slight, almost imperceptible twinkle in his hardened eyes. After extensive discussion with Base Command, a comprehensive review of your service record, including, I might add, your astonishing, albeit unauthorized, simulator scores and flight log data, and taking into account the extraordinary circumstances of Captain Miller's testimony, we've decided that your actions, while unauthorized and certainly unprecedented, were ultimately in the best interest. Captain Miller's life was saved. 3 enemy threats were eliminated. No further escalation occurred. These facts are undeniable. Valerie blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. Her mind reeled. You're being reassigned, Captain Kincaid, General Vance stated, his voice now firm, decisive. Effective immediately. You're being transferred to the Elite Air Response Squadron, an experimental, highly classified unit designed for impossible missions, for scenarios where conventional tactics fail, where only the most adaptable and skilled pilots can succeed. Your unique combination of skills, initiative, and, shall we say, independent thinking can be properly utilized there. It is a unit where breaking the mold is often the only way to achieve victory. And Captain, your flight hours are about to become very, very real and very, very demanding. The words hit Valerie like a physical blow, a sudden, overwhelming wave of shock and profound relief. Not punishment, but promotion. Not discharge, but recognition beyond her wildest dreams. She struggled to find her voice, the words catching in her throat, a choked sound of gratitude escaping her lips. Sir, I thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet, Captain, General Vance said with a slight knowing smile. EARS is going to put you through the most intensive, rigorous training program in the military. You'll learn skills that will make your solo canyon run look like a leisurely stroll in the park. You'll be pushed to your absolute limits, physically and mentally. And you'll do it all while maintaining the highest standards of military discipline, because within EARS the rules are different, but discipline is paramount. Because the next time you decide to ignore orders, Captain, you better be damn sure you're right. And you better have a damn good reason. With indisputable results. He held her gaze, a silent challenge and promise in his eyes. 6 months later, Captain Valerie Kincaid stood in a briefing room that hummed with a vastly different energy from the one where she had once been relegated to updating flight manifests and monitoring mundane communications. This room, located deep within a secure, undisclosed facility, was the nerve center of the Elite Air Response Squadron, or EARS. Here, the air crackled with the quiet intensity of elite pilots, tactical specialists, and brilliant engineers, all working in concert, united by a common purpose, to accomplish the impossible. The stylized phoenix rising from flames on the EARS patch on her shoulder carried a weight that her logistics insignia, or even her standard pilot wings, never had. And when she spoke, people listened with focused attention, their trust earned through countless shared risks and impossible victories. The target acquisition in Sector 12 is challenging, but manageable, Valerie stated, her voice calm and authoritative, pointing to a swirling holographic topographical display that shimmered in the center of the room. The map showed a complex network of rugged mountains, deep valleys, and newly identified enemy installations. Quote, "The key is the approach angle. If we come in from the northeast, utilizing the high-altitude cloud cover for concealment, we can establish a secure engagement point here." Her finger traced a precise arc on the holographic projection. Then descend rapidly to acquire the target before their long-range radar can get a lock. Captain Harding, now her direct commanding officer within EARS, stood beside her, his arms crossed, a rare, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He was a different man here, stripped of the rigid, often stifling protocols of the main base. In EARS, his strategic mind was allowed to truly flourish, pushing boundaries rather than just enforcing them. "How long for target acquisition and neutralization, Captain Kincaid?" he asked, his voice reflecting a deep confidence in her judgment. 45 minutes to acquire. Another hour to confirm target destruction and clear the hot zone," Valerie replied, her gaze moving across the assembled team, making eye contact with each pilot, each tactical officer. "Weather window gives us 3 hours before the storm system moves in from the west. Acceptable margins, sir, but will need to be swift and decisive." "Acceptable margins," Harding concluded, his smile broadening. "All right, team, listen up. Kincaid, your lead on this one. Sparrowhawk 1, you're cleared for launch. Execute as planned." "Sparrowhawk 1, cleared for launch." Valerie still felt a thrill at those words, a surge of pure, unadulterated exhilaration, especially with her former F-16, the very jet that had facilitated her defiance 6 months ago, now officially her assigned aircraft, rechristened and upgraded with bleeding-edge technology. Even after dozens of successful missions with EARS, impossible rescues from collapsing structures, daring reconnaissance flights deep behind enemy lines, surgical strikes against overwhelming odds, the validation never got old. She'd proven herself time and again, not just to Major Harding, not just to General Vance, but most importantly, to herself. She had earned her place, not by conforming, but by excelling beyond all conventional boundaries. As the team prepared for deployment, a familiar figure entered the briefing room. Captain Miller, now fully recovered from his injuries, walked with only the slightest limp, a subtle, almost imperceptible reminder of their shared experience in that treacherous canyon. He was now assigned to a new liaison role, observing EARS operations and advising on pilot recovery protocols. His presence in the briefing room was a testament to Valerie's actions and his own resilience. "Kincaid," he called out, approaching her with a genuine grin that reached his eyes. "Heard you're leading today's mission. Another impossible one, I presume?" "That's right, Miller," Valerie replied, adjusting the fit of her custom helmet, her own grin mirroring his. "Try not to crash any more F-16s. I'm getting too old to pull pilots out of canyons, even with a reinforced winch." Miller laughed, a rich, full-throated sound that still amazed Valerie. For weeks after the rescue, he'd struggled with nightmares, survivor's guilt, and the slow, painful process of physical rehabilitation. The fact that he was not only back in uniform but back to cracking jokes felt like a victory almost as significant as the rescue itself. "Actually," Miller said, his tone growing serious, his eyes reflecting a deep gratitude, "I wanted to thank you again, Valerie. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I've ever properly expressed what you did for me up there. You gave me back my life and my future." "You don't need to, Miller," Valerie began, a little uncomfortable with the intensity of the direct praise. Such heartfelt acknowledgments were rare in their world. "Yes, I do," Miller interrupted, his gaze firm. "You saved my life when everyone else, including myself, had written it off as impossible. But more than that, you changed how this entire base thinks about what's possible. You changed how I think about what's possible." He gestured toward the briefing room, where soldiers from various units, not just ears, were preparing for different missions, their faces etched with newfound determination. "Half the people in this room have taken additional training, pursued new specialties, or pushed past perceived limitations because of what you did. They saw someone who refused to accept boundaries, who defied conventional wisdom, and it inspired them to push past their own." Valerie looked around the room, truly taking in the scene, and realized he was absolutely right. She saw Lieutenant Davies, who had been Miller's wingman, now an instructor in advanced evasive maneuvers and tactical desert operations, incorporating much of Valerie's own unauthorized tactics into the official curriculum. She saw Private Chen, the ground crew technician who had once whispered doubts about her, now secretly enrolled in a challenging flight training program, diligently working towards his pilot's license. Even some of the senior officers, like Colonel Thorne from Base Command, now championed new initiatives for cross-specialty training, citing Valerie's story as a prime example of untapped potential and the vital need for a more adaptable, multi-skilled force. Her unauthorized rescue, her moment of desperate defiance, had indeed created ripples that extended far beyond that single night in the canyon, transforming the very culture of the base. "The best part," Miller continued, leaning in conspiratorially, a mischievous glint in his eye, "is watching Lieutenant Colonel Hayes trying to take credit for identifying your unique skill set all along. He's been giving presentations at staff meetings about the importance of nurturing unconventional talent. It's almost comical." Valerie actually laughed at that, a genuine, unrestrained sound. Hayes had indeed rewritten history in his own mind, now claiming that he'd always known she had exceptional capabilities, and that her disciplinary issues were merely a sign of an untapped, unconventional genius waiting for the right outlet. It was a small, amusing price to pay for the profound respect and unparalleled opportunities that had followed. The mission alarm sounded, a sharp, urgent tone cutting through the camaraderie. It was time for deployment. Valerie shouldered her flight bag, the familiar weight, a comforting presence, and headed toward Sparrowhawk, her team falling in behind her, their steps synchronized, their resolve unwavering. As they walked across the tarmac, the engines of Sparrowhawk already spooling up, Valerie reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She was no longer the overlooked tactical comms specialist who counted equipment while others flew dangerous missions, dreaming of a chance she might never get. She was Sparrowhawk 1, team leader Captain Valerie Kincaid, someone whose opinion mattered, whose skills were not only valued but essential, whose determination had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that caution and precision, combined with unwavering courage, truly didn't determine strength. They defined it. The F-16, Sparrowhawk, roared to life, its afterburners painting streaks of fire across the dimming sky as it lifted off from the runway, carrying Valerie and her elite team toward another critical mission. Below, Base Falcon shrank into a mosaic of lights, a hub of human activity that felt distant from the vast, silent expanse she was about to enter. As they flew over the same rugged, mountainous terrain where she'd once flown alone in darkness, pursued by enemy jets, a familiar sense of purpose settled over Valerie. This was where she belonged, in the unforgiving crucible of the sky, leading others through impossible challenges. She keyed her radio, her voice clear and resonant. "Base, this is Sparrowhawk 1. We're en route to target coordinates. Estimated time to target, 30 minutes. All systems nominal, team is ready." "Copy that, Sparrowhawk 1, came the calm, professional reply from Base Command. It was Major Harding's voice, now a steady, reassuring presence on the other end, devoid of the earlier tension that had once marked their interactions. Be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Reconnaissance indicates a severe dust storm forming in Sector 12, unexpected and moving fast. You have a narrow window for engagement and extraction. Confirm receipt. Understood, base, Valerie confirmed, her focus sharpening. A dust storm. That added a new layer of complexity, reducing visibility to near zero and playing havoc with sensors. We'll adjust our approach. We'll bring them home. She then opened a private channel to her team. Team, intel update on the dust storm. We're going to have to go in lower, under the radar, and trust our passive sensors and terrain maps. Maintain tight formation. Visual contact will be minimal. A chorus of professional affirmations came back. They trusted her implicitly. She settled back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the holographic map now swirling with real-time weather overlays. The mountains below seemed to claw at the sky, their peaks jagged and unforgiving. Somewhere down there in a secluded valley, an enemy strongpoint was nestled, filled with valuable assets and hostile personnel, oblivious to the precision and skill heading their way. Somewhere, a complex puzzle needed solving, a scenario where conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done, where the risks outweighed the rewards for any standard unit. She smiled faintly. After all, proving conventional wisdom wrong had become her specialty. The radio crackled with another update from reconnaissance. Sparrowhawk 1. Further intel update. Confirmed enemy strongpoint now active. Multiple advanced anti-air batteries detected, estimated 6. 3 additional enemy patrol jets, MiG-29s, confirmed, are inbound to their location, estimated intercept in 15 minutes. They're establishing a cap. This is now a dynamic high-threat zone. Time was critical, conditions were challenging, and success was far from guaranteed. They were facing an active, upgraded threat, under worsening weather, with enemy air support incoming. In other words, it was exactly the kind of mission that everyone would have said was utterly impossible for someone like Valerie Kincaid just 6 months ago, let alone any standard combat unit. She was looking forward to proving them wrong again. As Sparrowhawk banked sharply towards the target coordinates, the F-16 slicing through the turbulent air, Valerie thought about the letter she'd written to her sister that fateful night before her unauthorized rescue mission. The one she'd never needed to send, but had kept. A silent reminder of her darkest hour and her defiant act. In it, she tried to explain why some things were worth the risk, why proving yourself sometimes meant defying the people who claimed to know your limitations, why the drive to do what's right transcended every rule book. Now, 6 months later, she understood that the real victory wasn't just in saving Miller's life and eliminating those initial enemy jets. It was in changing the conversation about what was possible, about who deserved opportunities, about the crucial difference between blindly following orders and serving a larger purpose with strategic, disciplined initiative. The target strongpoint, a hardened facility nestled deep within a treacherous, now dust-shrouded valley, came into view ahead on her enhanced sensors. It was another impossible mission waiting to become routine for ears. Valerie keyed her radio, her voice calm, professional, and radiating an unshakable confidence as she guided her team toward another group of adversaries who needed someone to believe that impossible wasn't permanent. "Team, we're beginning our descent," she announced, the engines of their F-16s throttling back for the steep controlled dive. "Remember, we go in together, we work together, we come out together, no one gets left behind. Target acquisition on my mark." "Copy that, leader," came the synchronized chorus of responses from her 2 wingmen, their voices crisp, ready, and utterly trusting. Valerie smiled as Sparrowhawk began its final approach, piercing the swirling dust. Some days, she thought, being grounded just meant you were learning to fly higher, faster, and more decisively than anyone ever thought possible. The mission was just beginning, but she already knew how it would end. With the mission accomplished, the threat neutralized, and her entire team returning safely. Because that's what happened when people stopped accepting limitations and started exceeding expectations, just like she'd learned to do, one impossible mission at a time. The legacy of the Phoenix, she realized, was not just about survival, but about transformation. The mission to neutralize the Sector 12 strongpoint was a resounding success, a testament to Captain Valerie Kincaid's unparalleled skill and foresight. Her precise navigation through the swirling dust storm, utilizing a previously scouted, unconventional ingress route, allowed her team to slip through the enemy's advanced anti-air defenses completely undetected. With surgical precision, they delivered their payloads, neutralizing the hardened facility and its crucial assets before the inbound enemy patrol jets even reached their location. The three MiG-29s, caught off guard by the sudden and devastating strike, scattered and retreated when faced with the swift, decisive action of the elite air response squadron. It was a textbook operation, executed with chilling efficiency, another definitive demonstration of Valerie's unique blend of calculated risk, meticulous planning, and unyielding courage. Back at Base Falcon, the atmosphere had undergone a profound, almost palpable transformation. Valerie walked through the bustling hangars, no longer invisible, no longer the Sparrow grounded in a corner, overlooked and dismissed. Now, pilots, ground technicians, even high-ranking officers would pause their work to nod, offer a respectful salute, or stop to exchange a few words of admiration or seek her informal advice. Her reputation preceded her, not as a defiant renegade, but as a groundbreaking leader, a visionary who had proven that unconventional thinking, when coupled with rigorous preparation and unwavering dedication, could yield extraordinary results. One late afternoon, as she was meticulously reviewing flight telemetry from a recent deep recon mission in the EAR's operations room, Major Harding approached her, a thick, official-looking file in his hand. His once stern face now often carried a look of quiet respect, even pride. "Captain Kincaid," he began, his tone holding a warmth and ease that had been entirely absent in their early, strained interactions. "General Vance wants to meet with you. Says he has a special assignment in mind, one that requires your unique perspective." Valerie raised an eyebrow, a flicker of anticipation in her eyes. General Vance's special assignments were legendary within EARs, notorious for their extreme difficulty, critical importance, and the immense, often global impact they carried. "Sir, I'm ready for anything the General needs," she replied, her voice steady, confident. Harding chuckled, a genuine, relaxed sound. "I don't doubt it. You've exceeded every expectation since joining EARs, Captain. Your performance reviews are exceptional, even by our standards. You've not only mastered every skill we've thrown at you, every advanced flight technique, every complex tactical scenario, you've fundamentally improved our operating procedures. You've even implemented new, more efficient protocols for in-flight emergency repairs. Drawing directly from your logistics background, as you so aptly put it, we're calling it the Kincaid Protocol." Valerie smiled faintly, a genuine, rare smile that lit up her face. She had, indeed, integrated her meticulous attention to detail and her deep understanding of equipment from her past role into her current one, ensuring not only operational success, but also the absolute highest standards of equipment readiness and crew safety. It was a fusion of her two lives, her two selves. "Speaking of which," Harding continued, his expression softening further, "Pilot Miller's recovery has been truly remarkable. He's back in the cockpit, albeit on non-combat flights for now, assisting with training new recruits. He's been lobbying the brass tirelessly for a new cross-training program for pilots and ground personnel to better understand each other's roles, their limitations, and their capabilities. Says it's specifically inspired by someone who understood both sides of the coin, who saw the whole picture. He's actually calling it the Phoenix Initiative, after our squadron's emblem." Valerie felt a deep warmth spread through her chest, a profound sense of satisfaction. Miller's recovery and his dedication to improving the unit, to fostering a deeper, more empathetic understanding within the military, were deeply rewarding. Her actions hadn't just saved one life, they had sparked a fundamental positive shift in perspective across the entire base, creating a ripple effect that resonated far beyond her individual story. Later that week, in General Vance's spacious, austere office, Valerie received her new groundbreaking orders. She wasn't being reassigned from EARs, but rather, she was being tasked with leading a new pivotal initiative within the squadron. "Captain Kincaid," General Vance boomed, his voice echoing with authority. We're expanding ears. The successes you and your team have demonstrated have convinced Command that we need more pilots like you. Not just skilled, not just brave, but truly adaptable, resourceful, and capable of operating entirely outside the traditional operational box when the situation demands it. I want you to head our new Advanced Tactical Development Unit. You'll handpick recruits from across the Air Force, design entirely new training programs, and push the boundaries of what's possible in aerial combat and extreme rescue. Your mission, Kincaid, is to forge the next generation of impossible pilots to ensure that no soldier, no mission is ever written off as too difficult again. It was a daunting task, a monumental responsibility that would demand every ounce of her intellect, her experience, and her unwavering resolve. But it was also precisely what she had always yearned for: to not just participate in the future of military aviation, but to shape it, to empower others to reach their full, unacknowledged potential, to actively dismantle the very limitations that had once held her back, to ensure that no one else would ever feel grounded when they had wings. Valerie stood tall, her uniform crisp, her gaze locked with the general's. A determined glint shone in her eyes. "Sir, I accept. I will build you the best." As she left the general's office, the weight of her new responsibility, both exhilarating and humbling, Captain Valerie Kincaid knew her journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a pioneer, a mentor, a force for change, leading the way for others to follow. The Sparrow had indeed taken flight, soaring higher and faster than anyone had ever imagined possible. She had proven that being grounded was merely a challenge, that being too small was a profound misjudgment, and that true strength lay not in conforming to conventional expectations, but in bravely, intelligently, and decisively exceeding them, one impossible mission at a time. The sky, she realized, was no longer a barrier. It was her boundless frontier, stretching out before her, filled with endless possibilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.